Colonel, you and I have talked off air about why there is no negotiation or communication going on between the Russians and the United States. We know that there was communication going on even at the height of the Vietnam War and throughout the Cold War, but there's no communication going on now. Secretary Blinken seems to feel that a ceasefire would be a cynical trap. What's your take on this, Colonel?
Well, I'm not sure he could give you a different answer. Remember that the people we're talking about in Washington are universally ideologues. And given their ideological mindset, a discussion with anyone who disagrees with them is impossible. Anyone who opposes American policies in any form, particularly military policy, strategic policy, is by definition an enemy. I mean, this is the sort of, remember, this was the George Bush message, you're with us or you're against us. This is ridiculous nonsense. But we're not interested in winning anything. We keep talking about helping Ukraine win, but what does a win look like? Has anybody ever described victory?
I don't think that they can define a win. It can't be the removal of Russian forces from Crimea. That's not even militarily conceivable. It can't be the removal of President Putin from office. These are probably on the wish list of Victoria Nuland and maybe Tony Blinken, but these things are not realistic.
Well, from the neocon or globalist standpoint, if anything they do harms Russia and its leadership, it is by definition strategically positive for the United States and its allies. I don't subscribe to that view. But then again, people don't think carefully when they start wars about how to end them. And if you take the position that the only way the war can end is with the complete destruction or near complete destruction of your opponent, the war is not likely to end anytime soon, and sometimes never. Unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with.
Colonel, President Zelensky gave an interview in English to an American reporter. I don't recognize her, and I don't know the name of the network for which she works. They're on a train. We're going to run this in just a minute. There's a little bit of background noise from the train, but you can hear what they're saying. The essence of what he's saying is he needs, I don't know if he understands this properly. He needs to win Bakhmut, and President Putin needs to win Bakhmut for PR reasons. So take a listen, and then maybe we can dissect what he says.
Is this part of why you are fighting so hard in Bakhmut? Because a lot of military analysts will say that strategically it's not that significant.
Because that will be victory for him. He will
any victory.
Yes, he will sell this victory. He will sell this victory to West, to his society, to China, to Iran, to all the countries, to Brazil, to Latin America countries, not to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Of course, they really understand, from details, and they feel this dangerous because they neighbors. But he will sell it to his society. That was the first step. Now, wait a minute. I will have decision with Ukraine. Then another step.
Is Bakhmut militarily significant, strategically significant, or just emotionally, PR-wise significant?
I think most analysts that have looked at Bakhmut recognize that town is the keystone in the edifice of the defense of Donbass. That once that falls, because of its unique position, the road networks that run in and out of it, rail lines, the various factory installations, mines, presumably supply depots and other things, it is very important. And that once it is taken, it's questionable how you build another effective defense line on the scale of the one that you had in Donbass. So I think it is very important, and I'm sure he knows that. As far as PR is concerned, he may not realize what a PR disaster he now has on his hands, because he's effectively saying that he's sacrificing tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives in order to convey the impression that, first of all, Ukraine can still win, but he argues to deprive Putin of some sort of PR success story. The Russians have a lot of capability right now, a lot of forces. They're not moving because they're not going to slug their way through the sea of mud that has famously stopped armies for centuries. They're waiting for that to dry out. They are going to attack when it dries out. He knows that. He keeps trying to build this argument for an offensive that he's going to launch that will preempt the Russians. No one has figured out how he does that through the mud. Maybe he has a super answer that no one else has got. And secondly, we're not really sure what kinds of forces he has at his disposal. What I sent you in terms of the map gives you a rough estimate, but those numbers for the Ukrainians are rather soft. The numbers for the Russians on the map are quite hard. It doesn't take a genius to figure out where the Russians stand on this, and they can slug it out very quickly when they decide to do so. So I don't think Putin's in any hurry, and I don't think he needs a PR victory.
Gary, let's put the map up. There you go. So, Colonel, how accurate are these numbers? I see 130,000 Russian troops. I see 60,000 Wagner forces. I see 50,000 Russian troops from Donetsk. I see another 50,000 Russian troops on the bottom. I can't tell what country that is. I don't know if that's Crimea or where they're coming from. The Ukrainian forces appear to be less than half of the Russians.
Yeah, well, understand the 130,000 at the top are forces in reserve, uncommitted. That's very important. These are
but are they there? Are they there where they're shown on the map so that they can move east if needed?
Yes, they are. And they're spread out, though. They're not concentrated into a tight little ball for obvious reasons. So they're spread out from perhaps the top of the map down to the dark part in the center. But they can rapidly move north and south, east or west, because the road networks that the Russians control give them excellent lateral routes to reposition forces quickly. Now, the 60,000 Wagner troops, the 50,000 in Donetsk, Luhansk militias, and regular Russian forces fighting with them, where you see the curving red arrows around Avdiivka and Bakhmut, they're fighting right now. In other words, those are forces that are committed to the front. They're not all committed, but most of them are. And those that aren't are certainly in positions to defend. Then at the bottom, where you have the 50,000, these are the ones that are not far from Kherson, which is off the map to the left. Those forces are not necessarily in contact, but they are in defensive posture. In other words, they're ready for an attack if the Ukrainians launch it. Now, the point of this map is to look at the Ukrainian side. These numbers, 80,000 at the top and 40,000 to the left as you view it, those numbers were good a few weeks ago. We don't know precisely what they are because you'll see the dashed blue lines.
What does that mean?
That means that the forces that were formerly concentrated, as shown on the map, have been reduced in size and capability because they've had to move them to reinforce Bakhmut and Avdiivka. In other words, we may be looking at now 20,000 down to the left and maybe 30,000 or 40,000 up to the right because the rest of the forces have been drawn off to fight. Now, Bakhmut has reportedly fallen, which means they no longer have those defensive positions and are going to have to fall back further to the west if they're going to maintain any kind of coherent defense.
Colonel, let me interrupt you. Is this breaking news that Bakhmut has reportedly fallen, or is this a repetition of what we expected in the past week or so?
I have only received a direct statement that came to me from my sources that what you see, the distance between the two red arrows around Bakhmut is closed.
Do those arrows mean that Bakhmut is surrounded?
Yes. In other words, it's completely
surrounded by Russian troops.
Yes. And the Ukrainian forces, we're unsure how many are left. Maybe there are 3,000, 2,000, 4,000. But effectively, Bakhmut has fallen because those troops cannot be reached. They can't be reinforced, and they're on their own. So we'll see what that means over the next 24 or 48 hours. Do those forces surrender? Supposedly, a lot of Ukrainian troops have surrendered, talked about being isolated, having no support, having nothing to eat, having no more ammunition, and so forth. So at any rate, the point is that the totals that we thought were available just 2 or 3 weeks ago for counterattacks really don't exist anymore. It's something less than what's shown on the map. Secondly, they have to move across relatively open ground in order to reach the Russian lines. Now, this is a wonderful opportunity for the Russians because, as we've pointed out in the past, you have intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance platforms, manned and unmanned, from the ground all the way up to 30, 40,000 feet, low Earth orbiting satellites at 80, 90,000 feet. All of these can track with absolute perfect detail where the Ukrainians go. The result is that as soon as they are within, say, 10 or 15 kilometers of the Russian lines, they're going to be annihilated by artillery, rocket artillery, missiles, and conventional artillery. This is not a question of, well, the Russians have covered the road or the Russians have covered this. They've got the whole place covered. They're never going to get to the Russians. They're going to die in great numbers. So why, in circumstances, would the Russians move? You might as well sit and wait for what remains of the Ukrainian army to attack.
Wow. I want you to watch and listen to Senator Roger Wicker, Senate Armed Services Committee, interrogating the former four-star general who is now the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and tell me if you think the secretary is credible.
With regard to your optimism about Ukraine having the upper hand, that is what you told me yesterday.
It is. Now, what I was about to say, Senator, is that Ukrainians have inflicted significant casualties on the Russians, and they have depleted their inventory of armored vehicles in a way that no one would have ever imagined. And so now we see Russia reaching for T-54s and T-55 tanks because of the level of damage that the Ukrainians have inflicted on them.
Reaching for those tanks demonstrates what to you, sir?
It demonstrates that their capability is waning. We've continued to witness